Welcome to my first Urwigo tutorial. This tutorial is beginning and I'd like to explain a couple things. One, I chose Urwigo because of the easy Windows interface plus the emulation feature built into it. It just makes things very easy. I think it flows better than any of the other software that I've used so far. Not to say that something else better couldn't come out, but kind of want to just do some walkthroughs on how to do this, and I'll create a series of these videos as questions come up and as I figure things out. So first off, when you first start up Urwigo, you come to this screen right here. Alright, the first thing to know is that this is the name of your Wherigo. Here I'm just going to make a tutorial, a description here to show people how to make a Wherigo. Here, activity-wise, I have chosen a geocache. You can choose whatever you want. This doesn't really play in much configuration while on the geocaching web page. It's kind of like you're just selecting it for a feature that's not yet available. The start position. I like to put this in here. It doesn't really seem to, nothing really hinges on this, but it will ask you for it and act like it's a flaw in the software. I use as a reference point, really nothing more than that. Now, you can either click on this edited map and I can move this around wherever I want to, or for several reasons. One is you already know where you want it to be, or you're not connected to the internet, you can type it in here. Now, currently right here, it is just using degrees, however, you can type in the standard degrees, minutes that we're so accustomed to in geocaching, and it will convert it to this. I don't exactly know why it uses this format versus the degrees, minutes format that we're so used to, but it is what it is. Your start description. This description and these other descriptions, when you actually run the emulator, and I guess I can just go ahead and do that right now. If I run the emulator, and it will ask me to save it, we'll say, let's call it test for now. You can see here, tutorial to show people how to make a Wherigo. When you hit play, this is the big advantage to Urwigo, is you have this whole interface where you can actually test out your application and debug it and messages as you go. None of the other software so far that I know have that emulator built in. You can create a version, so if you want to use that as a reference piece, company name. Typically most of this stuff I leave empty, and then author I just left my name. Now logging can become kind of interesting. Logging will create a GWL file, and while a user plays it, if something happens, you will be able to dissect that GWL file and be able to hopefully solve what was wrong. Now, I'm not a complete professional in this stuff, and this is one area that I actually have problems with, is this Lua Code. Lua Code is the type of code that this is Wherigos are written in. So there's a lot of Lua Code that is not incorporated into this. However, if you wanted to write your own Lua Code, you could. So it leaves open that option to be able to do so. I have not been very successful with doing such stuff. I'm interested in it, but for the most part, everything that I've desired to do, I've been able to do with Urwigo without too much problem. There might be some Lua out there that might create shortcuts and things like that, but I have yet to be able to play with that type of stuff. As we scroll down, here we see events. Now, these events right here are only attached to when the cart starts, ends, resumes, and saves. This type of layout is all over the software. Right now it's probably looking foreign to you. everything that says unhandled right now, there is nothing that's incorporated. So if for some reason you see it, if you click on this, it will say tutorials on start drag actions here. That's where things will get to, and we'll touch base on that. So here are commands that happen when the cartridge starts, when the cartridge ends, when the cartridge resumes after a save state, and what happens when it's saved. I've used these in a couple different cases where I'm recording statuses of things as people do them, just so when they start back up or something like that, it remembers where they are. Unstart usually incorporates a lot because that's where you set up a lot of your base variables and things like that. You can set them in the variables in it, but there's other things you may want to incorporate. Like one of my applications, I have a time clock check to make sure that when the Wherigo starts up, it's between certain hours. That way, when they start up, it checks the time clock, and then whether or not it opens up the first zone or it does not for a night Wherigo. So there's many different ways you can utilize this. On global zone events, this is nice because there might be certain things that occur every time as a person enters a zone or exits or gets close to it, or the status changes. This here makes code very simple if you want something to happen like that, such as every time somebody enters a zone, you're tallying a score. Every time somebody exits a zone, you're tallying a score. Those type of global zone events simplify things. Not only that too, but you can also make sure that a variable is kept up to date, and you don't have to incorporate that in each individual zone. You can add it into the global zone events. Emulator protection. I'm sure a lot of people are not familiar with this because I've played with a lot of Wherigos, and the Garmin Colorado and Garmin Oregon have the ability to where you can turn off your GPS radio and actually emulate GPS signal. When you do that, it then gives you the ability to play a Wherigo without actually being at the location. I've seen that in several cases on different Wherigos. At least initially, I've been kind of preaching that out to a couple people about making sure you enable this emulator protection. It's great to have off when you're testing, because if you have one of the Oregon or the Colorado, you actually can do quite a bit of emulation, and with that emulation, do a lot of testing and fixing out bugs locally versus having to go out into the field a lot, which, as you find that a Wherigo is actually quite labor intensive. There's a lot of checking, a lot of playing, a lot of debugging, depending on how involved your Wherigo can be. Simple tours and things like that, I've gotten it down to a science to where I can feel pretty comfortable creating zones and things like that, and my interaction in the basic software that I have written works very well. Whereas if you're new, you're going to want to test this Wherigo out outside and play with it, and maybe even have some other people with different devices do testing on it, because different devices will actually work very differently. I find that the Oregon is probably the most finicky as far as being able to run Wherigos. The iPhone and Androids are very, very good at running them, and the Colorado is not as finicky as the Oregon for some reason, but it is also running on older software like the Oregon, so some options are actually not available via the Colorado and Oregon, and we'll run into things like that too. So to continue the tutorial, most of the stuff that you will deal with over here in the objects and properties. In the tutorial here, you can actually define whether or not a cartridge is complete, and these are variables and stuff like that. So these are things that you'll interact with. The activity type if you want, this is a variable here that you will be able to reference if you wanted to pull up whether it was a geocache or a puzzle or something like that. Display, image, and that all kind of goes back to what's going on here. And you actually can control what image an icon is here, and that's a variable, so then you can actually change it as the game progresses if for some reason you plan to do so. You can change the name of the tutorial or reference the name. Description, start description, version, company, author. All these items are variables that can be changed or referenced throughout the game for some reason if you so choose to. Player. Player name is whoever that downloaded the the Wherigo cartridge. So one thing that's always been conflicting is how you actually log some of these Wherigos. The Wherigo site completion code is tied to each individual account. So two people can complete the same Wherigo and they will get a different completion code. So that is something to know. So name right here is whoever downloaded the cartridge. It's not whoever is holding the GPS or anything like that. It's whoever downloaded the cartridge, and their name is actually attached to the cartridge. Now in this tutorial, or the program here, if I go into the settings here and go into the build, my offline player name and my offline completion code are created here. So those two items right there is when I'm actually doing the emulation, this will show up as the player name and this will show up as a completion code. It means really nothing. All it means is that's a display number for when I'm running emulation so I can reference something. Inventory count. It's just a count of how many items are in the player's inventory. There's more about inventory later on too. Environment. The environment here, as far as platform, device ID, device. The device in that basically tells you what kind of device the cartridge was downloaded for. The device ID is information about the actual device being played on. It will give you the serial number and things like that. You may, if you get really complex Wherigos, you may decide that somebody who's playing on an iPhone have a feature versus someone who's playing on organ. I haven't had to do that. I try to keep it simple. Well, not so simple, but typically simple enough to where things are going to be the same at work constantly. This obviously here will allow you to pull up the version of the device being played on. If for some reason that is critical, and you might reference things differently. Current objects. If a person is in a current zone, if a person is in a current talking to a current character, has a current item, task, current input, current timer, you can reference that stuff, and it doesn't matter. It's kind of a indirect tag that pulls up information, so you're not like calling a specific zone, you're calling whatever zone such and such. So if you can say, if this is, whatever zone is active, deactivate it versus reactivate it. And this becomes kind of handled because you can copy and paste code very easily without making a lot of changes and things like that. So the code, or in certain areas where you become what they call functions, will actually open and close, and you can use the same code over and over again without having to write a bunch of code. Zones. Zones are very critical. If you double click on the zone, where you get this over here, if we create a new zone, we get lots of stuff here. So first off, let's just give the zone a name. We'll just call it zone 1. We can give it a difference. It's the first zone in the Wherigo. The identifier right here is something only used for Lua Code, so I always leave this as automatic. If you get rid of that automatic or put something else in there, typically, as you can see down here, there's this aired list. Right now we just need 3 points to define the zone. If you include something in here that is incorrect, it typically won't tell you that, but when you're playing the game, it will actually error something out typically. So I usually leave this as automatic display. This is whether or not the zone is actually visible to the player. You can have zones that are visible and zones that are invisible, and then there's also active, which actually rolls into that. So if you for some reason wanted to create a zone that was invisible but active, and you wanted it to trigger an audio sound, if the player walks through that zone, they won't be able to see that they walk through that zone, but the zone won't interact with the user. That's display. So if display is clicked, the user will be able to see it when it's active. If it's not clicked, they will not be able to see it if it's active. Image. Image is basically when you actually go into the zone and somebody clicks on the zone, it will show an image that represents the zone. So say if the zone is attached to a house or supposed to represent some type of structure, you can incorporate an image of that structure into the Wherigo. Typically this is something that's you got to pay attention to, because image is very critical in its resolution. Well, not resolution, but more of its size. Most GPSs have very limited screen DPI, and therefore you don't want to have too high grade of an image. Most of these are like 100 wide by 160 high images. Smaller is better because it will cut down on the size of your Wherigo and other complications. But don't get too graphically heavy as far as trying to create big detailed maps or something along those lines, because people probably won't be able to see them on their player. Now icon are typically 32 by 32. The icon is when you're seeing a list of zones that are available to the user. In this case, the icon will be showed and it will be seen, versus the gigantic image. Some people try to use the image as the icon, and that typically only shows the top left-hand corner of the image, and it doesn't get them what they actually desire. Active. Active is whether or not the zone is active. Now, if I check this box right here, this zone, when we start the Wherigo, will be displayed and active. All this means is at the very start state, what is that zone? I can deactivate that zone and then through variables and code activate it whenever I need to. So you don't have to have all these zones active, and it's actually very critical because in some of the GPSs the number of active zones is limited. Mostly the Oregon. I've had pretty good success with the Colorado and the iPhone and the Android of having lots of zones open. The Oregon seems to be the only one that has issues with more than 8 zones open. So be very careful on that type of stuff, otherwise you'll find out that people will not be able to play very well, and you'll have all kinds of problems and people whining. So the hint is that as people exit zones and they no longer will interact with them, you need to deactivate them to prevent issues from happening. You also find that gameplay will occur smoother if there's less zones active. There's very certain ways to play around with this too. I have a Wherigo that I'm currently working on that has about 26 zones in one area. And that whole 26 zones is just a city area comparative to a very much larger kingdom or realm. When the person leaves this huge zone, all the zones inside there become deactivated. Depending on what task and what mission they are on, only certain, when they re-enter that city, do certain zones become reactivated. So those type of things you'll have to work with logistics and things like that to be able to understand and make show objects. Some objects are on display, and depends on when they are on display. So objects are not just limited to items, they're characters also, and you can, each one of these characters or items, when do they show up? So typically only when everything's usually set up to where when you enter the zone. You can have it on proximity, you can have always or never. So it depends on how or what the mission is of this. You can also say whether or not this is always considered in range. Now, in range, in proximity, are a couple things that I have not used really at all. So you can have multiple layers on a zone. So a zone would be whatever's drawn. And let's go ahead and show you here. So if I go and edit map here, I can look at this map. And I'm going to say, I'm going to take this parking lot right here, and I'm going to make it a zone. So I just click the corners, and that makes it a zone. Now there's no limitation to how many corners I have. I can make this thing a lot of different areas. You know, be careful from doing something like that, because you don't want that. But you want to create a open zone. And zones are very critical when you make them too, because you want a zone to be decent size, because you're looking at a GPS that has plus or minus 20 feet. So you don't want to make your zones very tiny. You want to make your zones as large as you can. The other hint is that if you're doing a tour and I'm trying to walk somebody down this road, I would want to make this zone precede an item that I'm asking them to look. That way, whatever you're doing activates maybe before you see something, or well before. So if I want them to see that something is right here, I should incorporate that into my zone, but make it further. What you'll find out is if you don't do something like that and they walk into this zone going this way, and the trigger doesn't happen to like right there, they may walk past it before they get the status that something they need to do. This way here, they get the status, and as they're walking, they get to where they need to be. Is been a helpful hint that I've seen done in some of these things. So let's go ahead and we'll highlight this whole area right here. We'll just make this zone very large. All right. So we got 4 points that we just made, and you can see here these points get populated in here, and I have made quite an extensive border points, and I have not seen a limitation to these border points. Now, in range means you're inside the zone at this point. If you click this here, then you can incorporate how far out from that zone this person can be and to be in range. You can also do that same thing with them in proximity. So maybe you're doing a zone, and when somebody goes to enter it, you want a sound to hit before they get into the zone. You can trigger that sound off in proximity versus being in the zone. Make sense? All right. Commands. Commands are something that you can add into things. So you can create your own custom command. So if I click on new item here, we're going to come up here, and it's going to be enabled, and we're going to say sit down as the command. So when the person gets into that zone, they have the ability to sit down in the zone. It's not too complicated, but you can basically add into the storyline. You can typically target as none. You start getting into all objects and specific objects, you're getting a much more complicated thing. We could talk more about that later. You get into zones and items and characters that might have to be present to be able to give you this option to sit down. So that will be later on. So boom, we got sit down. All right, we got it unhandled right now. So when someone says sit, an action is sit down, nothing really happens right now until we set that up. And you can basically make this command whatever you want and interact. It could be talk to somebody, it could be pick up weapon, drop weapon, pretty much anything you can think of. events here. So events here is when you enter the zone, when you exit the zone, when you're on distance, and that distance is, and I don't know why they use this, but I would say that you want to call in distance, on distance is more in range, on proximity, and when the activity changes. So these are all different little areas that you can have when this zone interacts and things like that, people interact with it, you can have other bits of code fire. Alright, so now that we have all that, let's just go ahead and activate this area here, and we'll go ahead and run our, again. So we go here to play, and you can see that our little person here is inside that zone. Alright, so I back out, go back into the zone. Right now, no new tasks, no items, nothing of interest, location zone 1. So if you click on here, this is where you get to sit down. So if I click that, right now nothing's happening because we didn't have it do anything. So if you clicked on this locations here and there were multiple zones open, you would get a listing of all the different zones, and then you have to click on zone 1 and then have sit down to be able to sit down in that case. Some of the different Wherigo players actually do this a little bit differently, and you'll have to get used to those by device. Alright, so back out of that. Characters. Pretty much is self-explanatory in the most part. Characters, you create a name, you give them a description, so you can say you can basically do the identifier again, following Lua Code, display whether or not they're visible to the user or not. So maybe initially they're not anywhere. Maybe initially they are somewhere. Images, you can add an image or an icon for them. Since I made the person myself, I am male. And the location, I'm going to say, I'm not with the player, I am actually with the zone. Zone 1. So at this point here, and then you can also do the commands here. So you can say talk to land. So voila. The event here on click. This is something you don't want to use very often. It works extremely well with the iPhone and Android, but it does not work at all with the Colorado or Oregon. The on-click feature would be is when somebody clicks on, in this case, Land and Nina, there's code that runs. For some reason, those devices must have older software. This must be a later addition into the software, and it does not run properly with those devices. So avoid this. This here command feature is what you use now versus this. This will work just as well as this, plus this will work on all the devices. So do not use the on-click. There's also, this on-click exists in a couple different spots with items and other various things, and you want to prevent from doing that. Alright, so now if we go here and we go to run, we go to tutorial, hit play, and you can see here, we're in zone 1 already, and locations, you see me. So talk to Landon, you can hit that, voila. And you can see here too, when you click on me, it says I live in zone, which is that description. So that's how things go. So if I leave the zone, you no longer see me. You can see the zone and that we're 125 feet away from it. And it will give you the option to sit down, but you're not inside the zone, so therefore it only will let you actually click it and do things when you're actually in the zone. Alright, so next item. So we're going down to items. Items, pretty much like characters. So let's just say we have a sword. For some reason, it is a double-bladed long sword. Again, display. You can put these images in different things. And locked. you can lock the object into something where people can't pick it up or anything like that. Opened is just a status of an item. You can manipulate that as a variable location. Where do you want this? Is this character Landon holding it? Is it in the zone 1, just laying around, or does the player themselves have it in their inventory? So we're just going to say it's in zone 1. Now you can do a command here, like we've done on the other one. We can say grab. All right. Now if we do the grab, and remember, here's on click. All right. So just as a general, so here's grab. We're going to go ahead and put a code in here, and we're going to say when you hit grab, it's going to move. We're going to take that sword, and we are going to move it to the player. All right. So now if we go and run this, we go to tutorial, play. We're already inside the zone. We see the double, we see Landon, and we see the sword. So if I click on the sword, I hit grab. Now it didn't do anything. It didn't look like it did anything. But if you back out, you no longer see it in the zone, and you see it in inventory. So there's lots of little things here to learn. So one is when we hit grab on the sword, it stayed here, which is not real intuitive of why. So there's other things that you'll probably add in there. So when you do execute this, maybe you'll say show screen and have it shoot back to the main. Not only that too, but if you looked there when we got done with that, it also said that you still could grab the sword. So we could say the grab here is now false. So once you grab it, you can't grab it again. That's kind of bad. So if we run this now, hit play, we're inside here. So we see the sword. If we hit grab sword, there's two things that happen. One is it's going to disable the ability to grab the sword again because we already have it. And two, it's going to kick us to the main screen, kind of giving the indication that the player had grabbed it. They're not just sitting there looking at the sword. So if I hit grab, boom, it clicks us out to the main screen and shows the sword's inventory. And then you can see I don't have that grab action anymore. That has gone away because I disabled it. Okay. So that's just kind of an example of code that you will use, little things like that. Alright, so let's just continue on here through these items. Task. Tasks are little things that will people achieve. So you could just say grab sword is one of these tasks. So you can give the mission, all that type of stuff. It's active. Alright, so it's going to be told that at the start of this Wherigo, it's going to be active. You also can say correctiveness, which that basically ties to the fact that if the person has a certain arrangement of things, that it's correct, but it's not complete because it's corrected in the fact that you are capable of completing the task if you so choose, want to inform them of that. Say maybe to complete a task they have to have 3 items on them. They don't necessarily know what 3 items are, and you may say when they got the right 3 items on there, it's correct. Again, image and icon, you can associate that maybe with like a little badge or a little decal or something like that, or something or other, depending on what it is. Complete a change, you got all these different here, and remember, here's on click again, which you do not want to use. Alright, so what we can do here is to expand on that is we obviously want to grab sword. It's an active task. Alright, so if we go back to items and we go back to the commands or on the sword, and we got this enabled here, we grab, we can also set that task to complete. So task here would be grab sword active, and we will say complete, and we will turn that true. Alright, so now if we go into the task or go into the emulator, we run this, again, we go into there, sword. Well, let's get back out here real quick. So you can see here, task, grab sword. The mission is to locate a weapon. All right, so boom, we go here, we grab. Now the task is complete. Now it doesn't show any task available. Now in different GPSs and devices, this will show up as being different. You'll actually see the task and it will show it as being completed versus just disappearing in this Pocket PC emulator. So that's how you manipulate a task. Variables. Variables have lots of different functions. You use them a lot. We can basically do all kinds of stuff with this too. We can basically say this variable here is called weapon in hand. There's many different ways we can actually do this. One is we can actually say this weapon in hand is false when they first start. Now this is all default, is false. We can also do as a text string. We can say no sword. We also can say a number, which we can say 0 for nothing, 1 for anything. There's many different ways you can do this. I'm just going to go with the weapon in hand at the start of the game. It's false. So you can manipulate that by, if we go to, again, the items, we go to handled, we also go to set, drag in the set command, we do a weapon in hand, and we just say when they do this function, it is now true. So maybe we have many different weapons laying around, but we want to know if the person has a weapon in hand and they have to drop that weapon in hand before they can pick up another weapon. Is kind of the concept that I'm using here. But there's many different things. You could use this as how many zones were solved as a variable, how many, anything. You can also ask people variables, like say, ask them a question, and then you can save that as a variable, and then you can use that later on. So maybe you ask them for their real first name, and you reference that later on in the storyline by calling them by their first name. Many different ways to do stuff like that. Inputs. Inputs are questions. So this is kind of a different little point of view. So the name does not show up, so we might want to just call it question 1. You can give a little bit of description of the question. That typically does not show up for the user to see. This might be just for your own reference. You can give it an image if you so choose, because there might be an image actually is displayed in the player. It will actually show a picture, and then maybe the picture has something to do with the question. So you have several different types of inputs. You have text. So if you're going to actually ask the user to enter a text, you have actually ask them to enter a number. You do multiple choice, or you do true and false. If you do text, you would just type in what is your name. If you were doing, and then you would leave the input choices blank. And if you do number, same way. If you do true or false, it will give those two choices of true or false automatically. If you do choice, you can then say, well, what is your name? So you can give them, you list them as a feature. So once you create whatever type of input here is, you then have to do the onGetInput. And this is where the input gets a little tricky. So if I click on this here, it brings up question 1. All right. This is where you'll typically use a if-else statement. The if-else statement basically will want me to add in a series of things. So if-else, typically in this case here, we're going to use a compare. So I'm going to go down to the expression section here and bring a compare over. All right. And then answer. So the answer represents whatever input they gave you. So if they selected Landon, the variable answer becomes Landon. So I can say Landon. Now, this stuff here is cap sensitive in a way and all kinds of stuff. Now, if you're in the input and you're doing a text here, you can tell it to be, you can add multiple things in there to make sure it's a, but trying to make sure you're concerned to the fact that capitalization and other things are, so if I'm doing text and I ask somebody to give me a number, they may spell the number out, they may just put in the numeric number. You got to be aware that that's the possibilities of things that can happen. So choices, giving choice is very easy because then you're limiting the person to a series of answers. That way you don't have to guess too much. So compare. I can also add a second one here and add another compare. And I can say if the answer is Dina, right? So if it's Landon, I can actually tell it to do something else. So in this case here, I can just go like this and say message, and I can say hi Landon. But there's actually a much better way to do this, if you really think about it, is the fact that you got this answer. Why can't you just say hi whoever? Why have the whole if statement, right? You can do that. So I can say, put a message in here, and the message will be, I'll have to add in concatenate. If I put in a concatenate there, and then I put in a value, and then I pull that value to a string and type in hi and space. You got to make sure you have the space. So there's his hi. Concatenate basically allows me to addendum several items. So this here will be hi, whatever the answer was. All right. That will basically respond back to whatever the answer is. So the other part about this is nothing has triggered this input. So let's do this just for testing. We will have the, go back to zone 1 here, and we will have this input get triggered on the exit of this zone. So we go down to, or up here to input. We drag in input over here, and we pull question 1 in there. So when you exit zone 1, it will ask question 1. So let's go ahead and run this. Alright, we are in this zone. We see the sword, everything like that. Let's drag our character out of the zone, and voila, what is your name? So if I click on Norman, it says, hi Norman. Now if I go back in the zone and have it go back out again, it's going to run it again. What is your name? I say Landon. So it says, hi Landon. There's two things to think about on there. One is the fact that it constantly works every time you leave the zone. And it always answers whatever it is. So there's how to use variables to manipulate storyline and things along those lines. Alright, continuing on. We're now down to timers. Timers are periodically used when you want to keep score. Maybe you want to see how long it takes somebody to do a Wherigo. You can also maybe have sounds get triggered repetitively. You can do just about anything you can think of to do with a timer. So a couple things is, one is you give the timer a name. We'll just call it timer 1 for now. You can give it a description. And this is not shown to anybody, this is just for you, so maybe you want to write in a description so you can actually know what it is. Type 2 different types of counters. You got interval and countdown. Countdown is it counts down to 0 and it stops. Interval is it gets to 0 and it restarts again. So if you want like every minute to play a little sound effect or something like that while things are running, you can do that. So if we wanted to do just a standard countdown, we can actually set up an event when the timer starts. I've done that in a case where I had a chase scene, and anytime this timer started, you would have like a little chase sound effect going on to give you an idea that you're being timed. And when it stopped is when you would actually, if you weren't completed, the time by the timer was done, you actually died, and therefore I had like a dying feature on the stop. On the elapse, I've used that in a case where I was timing how long somebody wanted, how long it took somebody to play a game. So on an elapse timer, on the interval, I basically made this thing 60 seconds, and then at the end of the game, when they were complete, it would tell them how many minutes it took them to complete the game. So here's another note here. So if you put this over here, you can see here that for the timer of interval, it's during seconds. You can also say that this elapse here only works in interval. All right, the timers are pretty self-explanatory. Let's go down to functions. Functions are a great thing because they cut down on your code significantly. So if for some reason you're creating a game where you would have to have somebody die, and every time they die, you close out every zone, you change a variable that says they're dead, you then save their game, but there's many places that a person can die. If that is the case, then you don't want to insert all that code every time. You want to write that code one time and then just reference that array of code again. So if you wanted to say something here as in every time a person did something specific, that it would do stuff. So here I might say I am going to, just to keep it simple, because we're not trying to go too crazy here, I am going to, whenever somebody dies, I am going to save the game and close. That's all I'm going to do for this very example right now. So if I go into my zone and I have them say on exit here, they get asked question 1. I can also say that they're going to do die, which then means they're going to go function call. So you got to do a function call to call a function. I can drag in death here. So every time they leave that zone, they're going to run function death. Now I also can go in here and say when they grab this sword, that runs that function too. That way, for whatever reason, it can be called as many places as I want, and it will run, and then it will continue back into here again. So that's an interrupting function that can be ran in the middle of other code, and it very simplifies the amount of code that you will have to write for certain things. Alright, now we're down to media. Media is all what we talked about before, is the icons and the pictures for things. So if we go to new item, and we're just going to say, let's say house, right? So it's an image. You also do audio and text. We're going to do image. We're going to say, we're going to go with this little health thing right here. So this is what our little health, and see here, it's 32 by 31. So I'm going to say, we'll call this health icon. Alright. So now, if I go back to zone, and I click on here, and go to health icon, I can also click on image here. This icon here will be displayed to the player. Well, however, we're going to create another zone here real quick. We're just going to call it zone 2, and we're going to make it also active. So now let's go ahead and run the Wherigo. Oh, we have points for the zone 2, which we will just go ahead and make it this over here. And now we will be able to do emulation. Alright, so now you can see there is zone 1 and zone 2 in the locations. Now if I click on that, this is the icon that is shown. And you can see a little health, and it's almost improperly sized. So there's the icon here. If I click on here, we don't see anything because I didn't have anything in the true picture, but we can then see. So if I move out of here, boom, it's going to close the tutorial and try to save my game because that's our function call. You can always click no, which is kind of a problem. In the Android and iPhone, you can actually bypass some of that stuff, so there's tricks around that stuff too. So okay, so we're going to call that a conclusion to the first Urwigo tutorial. I will upload this, and hopefully you guys will respond back and see how things go. Hope you enjoyed this, and hope to be making more. Thank you.